We have a long list of people to thank who made this day possible. I want to thank Dr. Julie Moody Freeman, the co-director of the social transformation with myself, and also our coordinator, Alex Delgadillo, who is up in our office right now. Especially I want to thank our guests who have traveled from afar away to meet us here today. Dr. Rod Ferguson, our STRC faculty and student fellows. Later this afternoon, we'll be seeing artists Arius Dennis, Deshawn Jordan, Diana Solis, and Maggie Takuda Hall. I want to thank the STRC Steering Committee, and we have to begin with thanking Associate Dean Margaret Story, who has been a tremendous supporter of our program and is with us there fighting every single moment for it. Thank you. Also want to give a shout out to all of the different departments and members of the steering committee who are part of the STRC. The chair of African Black Diaspora Studies, Dr. Amor Coley. The chair of Latino and Latin American Studies, Dr. Carolina Sternberg. The director of our Global Asian Studies program, who I think is teaching right now, Dr. Lee Jin. And the Director of Critical Ethnic Studies, Dr. Lucas Bodas. I want to say a special thank you as well to the staff of the Center for Black Diaspora and the Center for Latino Research, the staffs, I should say, including Jennifer Gardner, Aaliyah Phillip, Marcela Reales Bisbal, Sara Luz Torres, and Jose Paniagua. And finally, although they're not quite here yet, they will be joining us throughout the day. I want to say a special thank you to members of DePaul's administration, Dr. Val Johnson and Dr. Salma Ghanem, who will be joining us later in the day.
Good morning, thanks very much. I'm Julie Freeman, the Director for the Center for Black Diaspora. I'm the co-director of the Social Transformation Research Collaborative, funded known as STRC, or STRC. To those of you here and those who joined us virtually, welcome to our second annual symposium. This year's theme is the right to story, race, gender, and sexuality in an age of banned books. We live in an age where bans on critical race theory and gender and sexuality studies have been codified into law. This reminds us how crucial it is for us to participate in telling our own stories and our own history. Some of our colleagues in certain states who are invested in teaching diverse college curricula on race, sexuality, and gender have been seriously impacted by these legislative bans. As a society, we are all affected by them. At the Center for Black Diaspora, the Center for Latino Research, the Departments of African and Black Diaspora Studies, Latin American and Latina Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies, Global Asian Studies, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Dean's Office, who all comprise STRC, felt it necessary to challenge these bans using what Roderick Ferguson calls interventions. In a piece titled In the Spirit of the Midnight School, which was published in the collection Our History Has Always Been Contraband, Rod Ferguson identifies strategies for interventions. For example, he argues, our present conjuncture requires us to extend these legacies of direct action and community activation. Doing so involves identifying and establishing the institutions and collectives through which we can foster intentions, forms of knowledge, and genres of strength in schools, neighborhoods, churches, mosques, cell blocks. The Social Transformation Research Collaborative's contribution to intervening in this moment is to bring us together today, senior and junior scholars from the Academy, writers, visual artists, photographers, muralists, children and young adult authors to present on their works. By continuing to tell the rich history and culture of Blacks and people of color throughout various humanistic and interdisciplinary fields, literature, history, art, photography, religious studies, women's and gender studies, and sexuality studies, African American studies, Latin American and Latino studies, among others. The contributing symposium keynotes and panelists will present their research, publications, art, and photography that make indisputable the importance of the lives, contributions, and stories of queer, trans, and cisgender peoples of color. So I welcome you all this morning. Please enjoy. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Margaret Story, Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences.
Well, it's my honor to follow Dr. Freeman in that wonderful opening statement. Thank you for that. That's really, really fantastic, and I think captures so much of what our goal is for this day, which is an important day for us for lots of reasons. And my name is Margaret Story. I'm an Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, and I'm also a historian. And my field is the 19th century United States. So I spend my time in the classroom and in research studying and analyzing and teaching about the history of racial injustice in this country, the political, social, cultural impacts of that over the course of the 19th century. And I sneak into the 20th occasionally. But I wanted to start just by saying that the college is really committed. Standing here on behalf of our dean, who is unfortunately unable to be here today, Guillermo wanted me to welcome you all and to say how important this event is to the college because of the commitment we have to this intellectual inquiry. This is central to who we are, it's fundamental to what we do, and for our reason for existing. I was also in preparation for this day, I was thinking about an article that I read some years ago, and I went back to it and found it was written by Professor Thomas C. Holt, who's a great scholar of the Black diaspora, comparative historian, really studied closely, comparatively, the United States and the Caribbean in particular. And in 2013, he wrote a piece called A Story of Ordinary Human Beings, the Sources of Du Bois's Historical Imagination in Black Reconstruction, which of course, if you haven't read it, but you might well know about it, is just an extremely significant text in Black history and historiography, but also for the historiography of the United States. And in that piece, Professor Holt said the following: the Jim Crow world was a shrunken thing, not simply because of its restrictions on where one could go or couldn't go, but by its limits on what one could think, imagine, dream, be. The actual diminution of one's ability to realize the full possibility of one's humanity. And it seems to me that that's the thing that's at issue with banned books. With the legislation we've seen, with the cultural and political backlash that we've seen, where we haven't even, if there's not a law that's been passed, there's this backlash, this atmosphere that's causing change in the way that we're allowed to access ideas and to hear stories and to tell stories. And it's a real threat, not simply to academic freedom, but to the health of our communities, our societies, our nation. It's fundamental. And even if we happen to be in a place where this is not pressing on us, it's our obligation to understand that we're part of a larger community that is being pressed in this way. He went on to say that when he noted, Professor Holt was born in Virginia in 1942. And said, of course, as a child, he had never heard of Black Reconstruction, which was written by W.E.B. Du Bois many years before that. And he wasn't surprised really that he hadn't heard of it growing up in Danville, Virginia as a Black youth in 1940s. But that even when he got to Howard as a student, he didn't really know about it. It wasn't until he began to do his own dissertation on Reconstruction that he became familiar with this work. And it was revolutionary for him as a thinker. He said, Black Reconstruction enabled me not only to imagine how my work as a scholar could be made consistent with the world from which I came, but to rethink, reimagine that world and the formative experiences of my recent past. So this works both at the level of community, the society, right, the nation, but it works in us at a very personal level. What can we explore? What can we tell? What can we share? Whom and how? Matters a lot. So I hope that today is a day of lots of sharing, lots of learning from each other and finding connections where we might have felt there weren't before. Growing in new ways and exploring the humanities and interdisciplinary studies in ways that give us courage and inspire us. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the rest of this day. And I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Polity, the chair of the African and Black Diaspora Studies Department.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out for this morning's session. I'm, as Margaret said, Amor Coley, and I'm the chair of the Department of African and Black Diaspora Studies at DePaul. It's my pleasure to be here and my real privilege, to briefly introduce this morning's speaker. Given the goals of the STRC, the goals of each of the units that have contributed to its foundation, and the theme for this year's symposium, it's really difficult to imagine too many more people who are more fitting for our keynote than our speaker this morning, Dr. Roderick Ferguson. He's certainly fitting just for the suppleness of thought and compassion that characterize his work, a compassion that has relational, political, and epistemological stakes, but also because some of his work has been effectively banned because of its removal from the AP African American Studies course. Banned books are, of course, not the books, but they're, of course, very much about the suppression and ultimate removal of the ideas, narratives, and breadth of the existence of many, many people, including many of us in this room. Those expansive vistas of being that those of us in the interdisciplinary or pluridisciplinary studies have worked to bring to the forefront in the academy while we work against the broad-scale denial of existence the poet and theorist Aimé Césaire once referred to as thingnification. Elaborating the wide, lovely, dynamic, multifaceted existence of marginalized human beings in and out of the university is part of what I read as driving Dr. Ferguson's work. One thing I'm particularly drawn to in his work is his interest through a variety of subjects in drawing out genealogies. And I can't help but think of genealogies as thinking also about legacies. Intellectual legacies, conceptual legacies, institutional legacies, legacies of struggle, of communities, of thinkers and actors. Not all legacies are gifts, but many are. From those who came before us, who wrote before us, who struggled before us, and who struggled for us. In his work, Roderick Ferguson honors them, and by doing so, honors the work and honors us. It is a gift for us to have him here with us today. Roderick Ferguson is the William Robertson Cole Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and American Studies at Yale University. He's the author of One-Dimensional Queer, We Demand, the University and Student Protests, The Reorder of Things, the University and its Pedagogies of Minority Difference, and Aberrations in Black, Towards a Queer Color of Critique. He's the co-editor with Grace Hong of the anthology Straight Affinities, the Gender and Sexual Politics of Comparative Racialization. He is also co-editor, and this is some of the genealogical work I was also talking about, with Erica Edwards and Jeffrey Ogbar of Keywords of African American Studies, a text that I find absolutely valuable, and thank you for putting it together. He is also the 2020 recipient of the Kessler Award from the Center for LGBTQ Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roderick.
to Dr. Mark Foley for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Yes, very great. Thanks to Drs. Julie Louis Freeman, Bill Johnson Gonzalez, and members of the Research Collaborative for this invitation. My thanks as well to Alex Delgadillo for taking care of all logistical matters. This is a very important conference, indeed. And I have to say, from all of the introductions, I feel I'm in the right place. So, you know, because sometimes you say yes to invitations and you go and you don't really know where you're going, what's in store, but, you know. Talk of Howardites and talk of Black Reconstruction in the 19th century and, you know, collaboration and compassion and critique. I'm in the right place. This is awesome. So when I was targeted by Ron DeSantis and the Florida Department of Education, one of the assignments that I set for myself to understand the targeting was just to do some reading on the genealogy of prohibitions around critical literacy, all right? And so I decided, I guess I could have gone to the McCarthy period, but I actually went to the 19th century. And the bans on literacy for enslaved Blacks, right? And in many ways, what I am presenting to you today, in the form of a written lecture, is the result of that reading, okay? All right, speaking of Howard University. There's a place behind Founders Library at Howard University that I would often visit when I was a student there because of an engraving on the back wall just above the steps. On the gigantic wall, a poem is stamped. Books are voices from past ages, records of the present, heralds of the future, torches to the unenlightened, common bond of cultured men, trusted friends developing the mind, restoring the spirit. Enter thou into this company and seek truth. The sexism and elitism of the poem notwithstanding, its sensibilities about books resonated deeply with me. I grew up in a small town in West Central Georgia where the nearest bookstore was 50 minutes away and the town library served a population of just 5,000 people. I applied to Howard because I had read in World Book Encyclopedia's entry on it that it had the world's largest collection of books by and about Black people. Because I was reading African history at the time, I imagined that Founders would be my version of the library at Timbuktu. Discovering the poem seemed providential. Here was the vision of literacy at one of the most famous repositories of Black intellectual production. Here was literacy and learning as an invitation. In our current moment, literacy's status as a mode of keeping company with fellow travelers is severely endangered. It is increasingly regarded as a threat to the well-being of children and to the life of this nation. Witness, for instance, Florida's HB 7, the anti-woke law. It argues that, quote, subjecting any student or employee to training or instruction that espouses, promotes, advances, inculcates, or compels such individual to believe specified concepts constitutes discrimination based on race, color, sex, or national origin, end quote. Its fear of learning is not even hidden. For the law, learning is the outcome of compulsion rather than the result of a mind hungry for new and often life-sustaining information. Moreover, it uses the principle of the civil rights movement, anti-discrimination, to protect whites from critiques of discrimination and inequality. I begin with the poem from Founders Library and the anti-woke law because they name a historical relationship that constituted our past and is shaping our present. Here, I am referring to the history of Black intellection as establishing a relationship between literacy and politics. I am also invoking the history of conservative forces as mechanisms that have always had as their aim the separation of literacy from political consciousness. And I hope to make the case that protecting the link between these two phenomena is as crucial today as it was then. In her book, When I Can Read My Title Clear, Literacy, Slavery, and Religion in the Antebellum South, the historian Janet Duesman Cornelius makes the stakes of literacy plain for enslaved Black people. She writes, quote, "For enslaved African Americans, literacy was more than a path to individual freedom. It was a communal act, a political demonstration of resistance to oppression and of self-determination for the Black community. Through literacy, the slave could obtain skills valuable in the white world, thereby defeating those whites who withheld the skills and could use those skills for special privileges or to gain freedom," end quote. Talking about the role that literacy played in the resistance to slavery, Cornelius goes on to say, quote, "This ability to disperse knowledge from the larger world was a crucial act of resistance during slavery. Word of abolition movements, the writings of escaped slave Frederick Douglass, and John Brown's execution quickly spread through the slave quarters because they were passed on by those enslaved African Americans who could read," end quote. Cornelius implies here the political character of literacy for Black people during bondage. Literacy disrupted the liberal individual subject as the privileged holder of knowledge. For enslaved people in this country, literacy would be held communally. Relatedly, literacy was defined through its dispersive agendas. It was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Perhaps this is so because people who were property realized the dangers of regarding knowledge as property. We can see early political iterations of literacy for enslaved Blacks in the story of Mrs. Lillian Granderson at her midnight school down in Natchez, Mississippi. The archive relates the story as such. Her number of scholars was 12 at a time, and when she had taught these to read and write, she dismissed them, and again took her apostolic number and brought them up to the extent of her ability, until she had graduated hundreds. A number of them wrote their own passings and started for Canada. In the story of Mrs. Granderson and her midnight school, we have both the elements of a politicized literacy as well as a communally held one. Mrs. Granderson's commitment to life-promoting knowledge and literacy was embodied in her decision to institutionalize a school in the midnight hours during the time that enslaved laborers could legitimately have to themselves. The right meant a reprieve from racialized labor and enslavement, and it meant that the creativity that enslaved Blacks might forge in those hours would take on the hues of a racial project as well. In the case of the Midnight School, it meant turning literacy into the anti-racist project of Black freedom. A number of them wrote their own passes and started the Canada. In addition, Mrs. Granderson's Midnight School disrupted an elitist distribution of education and favored a radical public dispersion of knowledge. When she had taught these to read and write, she dismissed them, and again took her apostolic number and brought them up to the extent of her ability, until she had graduated hundreds. Hers was a vision of public education for enslaved people. There were no interviews, exams, or applications for admittance. Whosoever will, let them come, she seemed to say. In Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, The great intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of the public schools and discussed the opposition to them among the whites of the day. He said, quote, "The owners of property believed that laborers did not need education, that it made their exploitation more difficult, and that if any of them were really worth educating, they would somehow escape their condition by their own efforts," end quote. Du Bois also noted the opposition to the public schools among the white working class, stating, quote, "The second obstacle was that the white laborers did not demand education and saw no need of it, save in exceptional cases. They accepted without murmur their subordination to slaveholders and looked for escape from their condition only to the possibility of becoming slaveholders themselves. Education they regarded as a luxury connected with wealth," end quote. Du Bois then argues that the idea of and support for public education came from the least privileged in that context. He writes, quote, "It was only the other part of the laboring class, the black folk, who connected knowledge with power, who believed that education was the stepping stone to wealth and respect, and that wealth without education was crippled," end quote. Hence, it was formerly enslaved blacks who understood education to be a right for everyone, regardless of class, gender, or race, but also took that education to be a fulfillment of the very fragile ideal of freedom. From the recently free, we received in this country the idea that education is part of a broader social apparatus and is vital for social, political, and human development. According to historians, it was the great revival movements of the 18th century that led to African Americans' conversion to Christianity. With its mandate for conversion, this religious ethos implied another mandate: instruction in reading. As Cornelius argues, quote, "The enthusiasm generated among African Americans by the popular churches during the Great Awakening sparked a growth in black churches, black preachers, and black reading," end quote. Cornelius continues by saying, quote, "During the period from 1810 to 1830, the contradictions embedded in modern slavery became more apparent," end quote. This 20-year span witnessed, on the one hand, the growth of benevolent movements that mounted campaigns to teach black people to read, as well as the rise of efforts to suppress black reading for fear of black resistance. In this context, some white slave-owning Christians would try to teach their slaves to read in response to the evangelical injunction that the ability and opportunity to read the Bible was necessary for salvation, not only for their enslaved laborers, but for the master's salvation as well. In those regions where teaching slaves to read was legally or informally prohibited, enslaved blacks finagled an education at the risk of whippings and dismemberment. Two books loom large in the early history of African American reading. One was Noah Webster's The American Spelling Book, containing the rudiments of the language for the use of schools in the United States. In the 19th century, the book sold over 20 million copies, and it was the reading primer for white children, slave-owning and not. Discussing the book's technique, Cornelius argues, quote, "Its step-by-step method, which heavily emphasized pronunciation, may have been tedious in the classroom, but was a useful decoding tool for the resourceful person who had to teach himself, including those slaves who took on the challenge," end quote. Whether taught deliberately or used surreptitiously, the book was a boon to the early developments of African American reading. Cornelius states, for instance, quote, "The speller's wide usage was shown by the number of former slaves who could quote those first vowel and consonant combinations decades after they had learned them," end quote. Despite their situation in bondage, enslaved blacks could use the blue-black speller, as it was popularly known, to develop a high level of literacy. Cornelius interprets this way, quote, "These former slaves who claim to have gone all the way through the blue-black and on to other books were reading at what would now be considered at least 12th grade level," end quote. They would be able to read such a sentence as, "A love of trifling amusements is derogatory to the Christian character." Now, to put this in perspective, the New York Times, a standard of American high literacy, is written at a 10th grade level. Enslaved blacks who completed the blue-black speller and were reading the Bible and books such as Milton's Paradise Lost, as an enslaved Lucius Halsey did after having been taught the alphabet by white children and an old black man, these people could read 2 years beyond even the current standard of that lofty periodical. In terms of the Bible, this was the text that enslaved people first deployed their hermeneutical experience. Noting their regard for the book, Cornelius writes, quote, "Former slaves recalled a reverence for the speller, which was surpassed only by their regard for the Bible," end quote. The religious studies scholar, Vincent L. Winbush, argues this about what African Americans learned from white evangelicals of the period, quote, "The lessons that the Africans learned from these evangelicals was not only that faith was to be interpreted in light of the reading of the Bible, but also that each person had freedom of interpretation of the Bible. Given differences between individuals and different religious groups, the Africans learned that they too could read the book freely," end quote. As a consequence, reading the book freely meant that enslaved people could interpret the Bible against the social grain. As Winbush says, quote, "They could read certain parts and ignore others. They could and did articulate their interpretations in their own way, in song, prayers, sermons, testimonies, and addresses. By the end of the century, the book had come to represent a virtual language world that they too could enter and manipulate in light of their social experiences," end quote. As an illustration of this, we might turn to the theologian and mystic Howard Thurman's story, speaking of Howard University, about his grandmother and her encounter with reading and the Bible. He says, quote, "Occasionally, when she was in an expansive mood, she would talk about her life as a slave on the plantation in North Florida. 2 of these stories I'm never tired of. The first, sometimes the plantation owner's minister would be permitted to hold a religious service for the slaves, and he always preached from the same text. Slaves, be obedient in your masters, for this is the right of the Lord." My grandmother said that she made up her mind then and there that if she ever learned to read, or if freedom ever came, she would never read that part of the Bible. So all the years that I was growing up and had the job of reading to her every day, I could never read any of the Pauline letters, except now and then the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Here we see how Thurman's grandmother's faith was undetermined by a fundamentalist regard for the text, but was instead molded by a critical and reverential engagement with it. There's another part of Thurman's story that gets at the issue of the free interpretation of literature. Thurman recounts that part. My grandmother's second story is even more important to me, but in a different way. She would talk about the times when a slave preacher was permitted to hold services for the slaves of her master and all the neighboring plantations. I don't remember how often this happened, but that it happened at all was tremendously important. And then my sister and I would be very still because we knew what she was going to tell us. This. It didn't matter what the text was, the minister always ended up in the same place. I can see it getting red. Then she would say, he would stand up, start very quietly, and then look around to all of us in the room. And then he would say, you are not slaves, you are not niggers, you are God's children. And you know, when my grandmother said that, she would unconsciously straighten up, head high and chest out, and a faraway look would come off her face. In the first story, we see a free and critical literacy at work in the grandmother's insistence upon distilling certain elements of the Bible, particularly those that supported her disfranchisement. And in the second story, we see the preacher demonstrating what aspects might be underlined in the same text to support the dignity and freedom of oppressed readers. There is nothing exceptional about what Thurman's grandmother or the preacher did. This kind of engagement was commonplace among enslaved blacks. And because of it, we may credit this aggrieved community with giving this country some of its earliest and most profound models of dialectical reading. There are several epistemological innovations that enslaved people cultivated as readers. I've already mentioned the first, the stories of Mrs. Gravison's midnight schools, Howard Thurman's grandmother, and enslaved people's regard for the blue-black speller and the Bible. Here, I am referring to the insistence upon the political stakes of literacy and intellection. For enslaved people, knowledge and learning were ways of identifying social urgencies, means of determining alliances, tools for imagining communities, and always resources for conjuring freedom. In addition, Black readers innovated a convention that lasts today. Here I mean the use of literacy to promote critical subjectivities. In the midnight schools, the students used their learning to steal the way to freedom. For the preacher that delivered his sermon to Thurman's grandmother, reading meant encouraging other Blacks to think of themselves as something other than what the whites said they were. In this instance, reading was a means to own the self, to claim that ownership as one's birthright, and to persuade others that this is their entitlement to. In his discussion of what the night meant to French workers in the early 19th century, the French philosopher Jacques Rancière says in The Nights of Labor, the workers' dream in 19th century France, quote, for the workers of the 1830s, the question was not to demand the impossible, but to realize it themselves, to take back the time that was refused them by educating their perceptions and their thought in order to free themselves in the very exercise of everyday work, or by winning from nightly rest the time to discuss, write, compose verses, or develop philosophies. These gains in time were not marginal phenomena or diversions in relation to the construction of the workers' movement and its great objectives. They were the revolution, both discrete and radical, that made these possible. The work by which men and women wrenched themselves out of an identity formed by domination and asserted themselves as inhabitants with full rights of a common world, capable of all the refinement or all the aestheticism that had previously been reserved for those classes relieved of the daily cares of work and bread, end quote. In terms of Black people, to take their freedom, enslaved people used literacy to educate their perceptions in a world predicated on not just class domination, but racial domination as well. Reading was not a marginal undertaking, but part of the revolution by which they would assert themselves as inhabitants with full rights of a common world, and in doing so, rewrite a racial order. The other innovation that the slaves created as readers was their ability to derive meaning from text that presumably held no meaning for them. Here, the blue-black spelling and the Bible stand as examples of early African Americans' hermeneutical ingenuity. How, in these little grammar exercises from this blue-black spelling, can I read my way of freedom? And what in this Bible can I learn of heroes and heroines and their overcoming? What might they tell me about being a child of God? In this encounter, enslaved Black people had to turn the blue-black and the Bible into texts that their authors never imagined, texts that would speak to and do battle with American racial modernity. We might understand the principle of this hermeneutic as the one most familiar to a slave. Use what you got. In the moments that preceded the founding of such renowned archives as Moreland Spingarn at Howard or the Franklin Library at Fisk University, and predated the founding of Black studies, the only thing that you had as a Black person to conceive your freedom were texts that never conceived you as a reader in the first place. If you were enslaved, it was incumbent upon you to determine how to read your interests, aspirations, and identities into text, onto text that were unquestionably negligible where your culture and your history were concerned. We are accustomed to talking about this use what you got strategy in relation to food. The stories of how Black people use the least valuable parts of livestock to make chitlins, mountain oysters, and crack them bread is axiomatic. But something similar happened with texts like the blue-black speller and the Bible as well. As they did with food, Blacks concocted ways to overcome the ostensible silence of the text where matters of race were concerned. As the articulations of canonical biblical narratives attest, the Negro spirituals demonstrate enslaved Black people's alternative reading practice. Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Why not every man? In his attempt to identify reading as an agency on par with writing, Roland Barthes argues, quote, reading is not a parasitical act, the reactive complement of a writing which we know, which we endow with all the glamour of creation and anteriority. It is a form of work, end quote. To read is not to consume the text, it is to remake it. Discussing the symbiotic relationship between reading and writing, Barthes says simply, I write my reading. Another way of reframing the story of the Midnight School would be to understand the students as saying, the passages that we write for our freedom are the purpose of our reading. Black reading has always been constituted as a site of glamour, adventure, and reconstruction. Whether we're talking about the blue-black speller, the Bible, or Paradise Lost, reading for Black readers in the antebellum period consisted of determining all the ways that one could read liberation from the book in front of you, to appreciate how this critical literacy was passed down to succeeding generations, we need only remember how the Trinidadian intellectual, C.R. James, read William Thackeray's Vanity Fair as a critique of the bourgeois establishment, or how Ralph Ellison was inspired by Andre Malraux's novel, Man's Fate, to produce work that would not toe the line to the detriment of artistic freedom and inventiveness, or how Toni Morrison read American literature, quote, to contemplate how an Africanist persona, narrative, and idiom move and enrich the text in self-conscious ways, to consider what the engagement meant for the writer's imagination, end quote. Reading one's way into new critical subjectivities and reading the text beyond the text. This is the history of Black reading as a kind of labor. All of us who do work on race, gender, and sexuality are inheritors of this legacy. It has been our special burden to figure out how to get negligible and often negligent texts to release their witting and unwitting insights about minority difference. It has been our particular assignment to rewrite those texts for audiences that are insisting on their right to visibility, despite the legacies of heteropatriarchy, ableism, slavery, and settler colonialism. The anxiety over Black intellection in the 18th and 19th centuries is a founding anxiety for dominant regimes within the US. It bespeaks an apprehension about the communicative nature of erudition and politicization. And make no mistake, the book bans and the forms of censorship that we are witnessing today have as their aim the suffocation of this legacy and its influences. For the repressive forces that brought us HB 7 is not just about suppressing critical literatures. It is also about preventing critical subjectivities from drawing their first breath. We see it, of course, in Republican attacks on Black studies, queer studies, and feminist studies. And distressingly, we are currently seeing the suppression around any public discussion of Israeli state violence against Palestinians after Hamas's heinous attacks on Israeli Jews. Discussing this worrisome development, the Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi warns, quote, "We are moving into a McCarthyite era where expression of sympathy for Palestinians is equated with terrorism and may be met with police state tactics. Students are being visited by the FBI." End quote. What the slaves evolved is only one part of the world's many traditions and of perseverance. Let us dedicate ourselves to discovering this vast reservoir of literacy and its ties to social transformation. Into this company, and seek truth. Thank you.